If the Liberals end up needing a speaker to give them a majority, would you or your party volunteer one?
The designation of official party status or not is not something that we particularly are pursuing at this time.
Someone else that actually decided to go on the media today and said some very interesting things. I haven't actually listened to this. I've read this part of the transcript, but it gives me it put me in a good mood. Put it that way. If everything I read is actually how it went. But CTV had a special guest on today, and it's everybody's favorite comedian. Unfortunately for all of you, there was no F-bombs dropped. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Don Davies, interim leader of the NDP.
Don Davies is the interim leader of the NDP. Mr. Davies, pleasure to welcome you back to the studio. I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks for having me, Vashi.
I wanted to start off on the question of official party status in what you're willing basically to trade for it. If the Liberals end up needing a speaker to give them a majority, would you or your party volunteer one?
Geez, that's a hypothetical we haven't even considered, to be honest, Vashi. And to be honest, the whole official party status issue, I think, is dealt with already. You know, we sought that in June, and that door was closed. So really what we've been advocating for is resources for all the party caucuses, because we think that in a minority parliament, all the caucuses need to be reliable partners and be able to participate meaningfully in the debate and discussion. So that's something we continue to pursue. But the designation of official party status or not is not something that we particularly are pursuing at this time.
Okay, so interesting point that he talks about, because Tom Mulcair was trying to say, oh, the NDP, I hear they're negotiating for party status now and blah, 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 blah. So it's nice that Don Davies is like, no, screw off. We're not looking to that. We're looking to get more resources for the NDP, but that's not going to influence anything. So get lost.
And again, I don't agree with the NDP's platform, but I think you can say that Don Davies is a pretty solid MP. He's got morals. Yeah,
and he knows how to crack a joke, and he knows how to drop some nukes on Mark Carney and the Liberals. So very interesting. But I like the opening section of this so far.
On kind of two aspects of that, on the resources part of it, but also on the hypothetical. I take your point that it is a hypothetical, but it sort of feels like a relevant one just given what's happened over the past few days. Is that something you would entertain if a request came your way?
To take a speaker spot?
Yeah, in exchange for the resources you're looking for.
You know, in a minority parliament, I think you have to be fluid and you have to be open. Like I said, we haven't had that proposal put to us, so I can't say that we've given any consideration to it, but you know, any opportunity for New Democrats to meaningfully participate in this parliament and make it work and function better, I think we'd be prepared to look at.
So when it comes to those opportunities, particularly in exchange for additional resources, this week I listened to you at the end of the sitting talk about how you think Parliament could work more effectively, basically, if the NDP was on the receiving end of those additional resources. And I think the headlines that came out of that mentioned official party status, but I take your comment earlier. On that front, I guess I'm trying to understand what you mean by Parliament working better. Does that essentially entail, in exchange for additional resources, that the NDP would help support and advance a Liberal legislative agenda?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? We're not looking to enter into a transaction. As New Democrats, as Jack Layton used to say, our first obligation is to make Parliament work for Canadians. And that's our first, I think, objective is, you know, how can we make this Parliament address the very real problems, crises that Canadians are facing? We have a completely out-of-hand affordability crisis in this country. I don't think it's a secret now. You know, groceries are too high, rent's too high. People are concerned about their jobs. So I think Canadians want us to tackle those issues. In terms of my comments on Parliament working better, look, I mean, the Liberals got just a handful of bills passed in the last 8 months. So Parliament is not, I think, responding to those crises with the urgency and the, I guess, effectiveness that we could be. And so we as New Democrats are looking for ways that we can make Parliament work better. And if that means adjusting resources and allowing us to have more say in things and to participate more meaningfully, we'll always explore those.
So I'll let that go for a little bit. So the conversation about the Speaker is an interesting one, right? Because the Liberals have 171 seats. They have 170 votes because
the Speaker doesn't vote unless there's a tie.
Right. So, but you don't want to have the Speaker having to vote every single time, because that starts to call into question the neutrality of the Speaker of the House, right? That's
no, but I think it's kind of everybody knows they're on party lines. That's why they don't get the vote unless it's absolutely necessary. Right,
but I think it's something that they'd rather stay away from, and that's why there's this question about that, right? But regardless, I think it's interesting that that Don Davies said nope, not interested in that. But we're in a minority parliament, so we'll consider everything. But that hasn't been discussed, and I think it's also interesting that he's saying, we want to participate more. Well, of course you want to participate more. The NDP wants to get more visibility so they can win some of their base back. So I think just based on the conversations that are starting to go on and how the NDP is operating, I think they're playing this very carefully, and I think they're playing this kind of, very well. And he's not trying to overstep because he knows I'm just the interim leader. This is not my party. So I also think that he's actually executing the job of the interim leader quite respectfully, even though I disagree with virtually all the policies of the NDP. I can at least acknowledge that he's doing a serviceable job at doing what his mandate is, which is you're to keep the seat warm for the actual leader when they come into play. And I think they have to be very careful, and it sounds like they're being very careful, to avoid that whole narrative that Jagmeet Singh had caused with the NDP, that they're basically, the whole NDP party was just under Trudeau's desk.
Yeah, they're like the lapdogs of the Liberals. But you said something that I thought was very interesting, which was that they want to get into committee, they want to get into question period because they want to show their base, like they want something to show their base. And without being able to ask questions in question period and without being able to get into committee, they really can't clip those questions or those comments the way that the other parties can, to put on Facebook, to put on X, to show their voters that look, we're fighting for you, look at what we're doing. So it is a lot harder for them.
Specifically, though, because the accusation leveled against, for example, the opposition Conservatives is that they're employing tactics to, at the committee level in particular, delay, stall things because of the NDP's reduced ability to kind of throw around its weight in the way that it would have, for example, under the former Prime Minister. In that case, the NDP really helped the Liberals, I don't have to tell you, advance its legislative agenda. What exactly are you willing to do in those committees? Would it mean siding with the government? And isn't that problematic given the message rather voters sent you in the last election?
No, we're not making any promises to Liberals or anybody else. I mean, in exchange for anything, we'll support legislation that we believe is right, and we'll oppose legislation that we think is wrong. My comments were directed more, Vashi, at the fact that there are no New Democrats on committees, and as you know, in Parliament, all legislation after second reading has to go to committees. And so if that process is not working well, and right now I would argue it's not, with Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois effectively teaming up to block or slow down legislation, and sometimes the Liberals too, the absence of New Democrats there to add a third option and to add our voice, which I think we've done effectively over the years, I think has damaged the ability of this Parliament to work as efficiently as it should have. So that's my point on it. But what I really want to talk about is I think how effective New Democrats have been in this Parliament. If you think back to April, there was a question about, would we be relevant? Would we have a voice as Parliament? And I think that we've demonstrated that we've been very relevant and have had a strong voice. And had an impact in many ways. And that's something we're going to look in 2026 to build on.
I'm sorry, I have to fact check Mr. Don Davies on this, because I hate to use his own words against him, but he stood up and he said, and I quote,
My name is Don Davies, and my pronouns are broke and irrelevant.
from the man's own mouth. I'm just saying, that's what he said. But it's funny that, both of us kind of made this point, because right after that, Don Davies starts saying, he's trying to tell everybody, look, we have been relevant. We have been doing that. So I think that's interesting. And he has to try to convince any of the voters that are watching the mainstream media, don't worry, guys, the NDP has been actually doing its job. Please vote for us in the next election. This is going to be the real challenge, is to, as Tanya said, convince these people that you're doing work and you are relevant, because that point about the clips is very, very important, because if there are no clips, then how do you show your base that you're doing anything? That's the problem. You have no committee clips, or very few, because they have been allowed to come on committee in very specific situations. And it's rare that you get to see them ask a question in question period. And if it is, it's at the very end and everyone stops watching by then.
Well, and I don't know of any private members legislation that they're putting out there right now. I mean, possibly there is some. I haven't heard of it. So I suppose the only ways that you would be able to kind of say your piece and get your information out there is by going on mainstream media or independent media, and possibly even social media. I mean, the MPs can post things that they're working on and things that they're doing in their communities, but again, there's only 7 of them.
Ask you, I mean this with great respect, like, what is the evidence of that? I think on a number of key priorities for the NDP, around advancing pharmacare, for example, around additional money for affordable housing, around limiting cuts to the public service, you've largely been unsuccessful in getting that message through to the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, what we pledged foundationally back in May was that we were going to dedicate ourselves to bringing the voice of working people to this Parliament. And I think we're the only party that has done that reliably and consistently every day. But if you want to look at some concrete examples, I would say that, the Liberals made the school nutrition program permanent. That was originally a New Democrat idea. I'm not sure they would have done that without New Democrats there pushing for that and holding them accountable. We just saw the 6 millionth Canadian get access to the Canadian Dental Care Plan. Again, would the Liberals have rolled back that program without having the New Democrats there to be watching and holding them responsible if they did do that? We know the Conservatives wouldn't have done it. Finally, the Liberals have violated organized labor's collective bargaining rights repeatedly, and we're the only party in the House that has stood up and held them accountable. So sometimes it's not about whether you get legislation passed, Vashi, it's whether or not you are bringing political focus to government actions that will maybe act to restrain them. And I would say that New Democrats have done that.
And certainly, Mr. Davies, I take your point on the NDP exclusively in some of those instances, highlighting and advocating for the set of interests that you just described. But on the last example, in contravening organized labor rights, there is no evidence that that advocation has led to meaningful change at the government level. They have, in fact, repeatedly, as you said, done the opposite of what you're advocating for. Does that not undermine your argument of relevance?
Well, not really. We used our second private member slot, which will go to a vote and a debate in the House Commons to repeal Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code, which is the section Liberals have used repeatedly to order flight attendants back to work, Canada Post Office employees back to work, port and rail workers back to work. So because New Democrats are there, we will have a debate in this House, and we will be able to raise the arguments and ultimately force the Liberals to have a vote on whether or not they'll support that. And maybe the Conservatives and Bloc will support us on that as well. So I just think we've been impactful. We're a small caucus. Again, I take us back to May when people were wondering whether we'd be able to be impactful at all, and I would say that we have been.
So you make some interesting arguments. I would say to Vashi, what do you expect them to do? They have 7 seats, but to Vashi's point, she's not the one who made the argument. Don Davies is making the argument that I think, we've been very relevant in this in this Parliament. I guess it just all depends on what you categorize as relevant. If you say, well, we've been relevant relative to our party size and our capabilities, I think you could probably try to argue that.
I'd say they've been relevant. There was one bill that the number escapes me right now, but they had made all these amendments in committee, and then when they brought the report to the House for everybody to vote on, the Liberals and the NDP voted it down. So all that work to make those amendments was just thrown in the trash.
That is true, because without the NDP voting with the Liberals on those, they that would have been a problem. But also, they've been relevant in that there's been some amendments that they voted with the other opposition parties on as well. So they were technically the swing. So you could also argue that they were relevant in some of those amendments, and some of them were good. Now, when it comes to repealing this section of the Canada Labour Code to remove the government's ability to order folks back to work, I don't know how I feel about that, because some of these are essential services. I don't know. And do you give all of the power now to the unions, and that there now is absolutely no recourse because you can't bring in scabs anymore because of that legislation that came in? So does all the power swing too far one way? I don't know.
Well, I mean, for certain industries, they're $1 billion a day industries. So by shutting it down, you're destroying the Canadian economy, and we can't let that happen. So if you say, well, no scabs, no this, no that, it's like, what's to stop the union from demanding something absolutely outrageous and saying, we will strike tomorrow if you don't meet our demands, and we know there's going to be catastrophic economic consequences.
And the counter argument that the unions will have is, well, without it, right now the employer has all the power because they can just knock on the government's door and legislate everybody back to work. So maybe the answer is something in the middle, that there's an intermediary step to get through in order to have to actually get to that point to legislate back to work. So it's a complicated issue, and we don't have the answer.
Also said toward the end of the sitting that given the legislative track record that you talked about, the small number of pieces of legislation that have actually gone through the full process, that you thought there might be an election sooner rather than later. Since then, there's been another floor crosser. They're one seat shy as we started this conversation off of a majority. Do you still think that's the case, or do you feel like there's less of a chance of an election now?
Well, what that question brings to my mind, Vashi, is really the way that the Carney government has governed from right of center. They have slashed public services, as you pointed out. They have rolled back environmental protections. They have attacked organized labor's rights. They have cut taxes for the wealthy. They cut taxes on yachts and private jets. And now we see two Pierre Poilievre conservatives, feel comfortable enough in a Mark Carney government that they would cross the floor to join it. So, of course, now they're one seat shy, so who knows what will happen in the new year. My suspicion is there may be more people coming from the Conservatives over to the Liberals. They may turn it into a majority government, but I think what it speaks to me is the New Democrats are the only party in the House of Commons who are bringing a progressive lens, progressive perspective to the issues of the day, as Carney is on the right of center, and of course Mr. Poilievre is to the right of that. So I think we're going to play a very important role in the Parliament, minority or majority, as we go into 2026.
And this is what we said that the NDP needed to do. They needed to try and distinguish themselves from the Liberals, and they were going to bring up the environment part. They needed to bring up their stance on Canada Post and the union and all of this stuff. So in my opinion, Don Davies is doing everything that the NDP needs to do in order to try to distinguish themselves from the Liberals and say, look, progressives, that's not your party anymore. Come on back home to the NDP.